I'm David B. Johnson, full-time self-cell coordinator at PNP, and I'm also a part-time professor of philosophy at Marymount University, which is right across the river in Arlington, Virginia. At a lesser-known institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Harvard, I've discovered, the course History of American Democracy is taught at the undergraduate level. Based on the case study method, this course tries to address two key questions. What does a healthy democracy look like? And how has American democratic governance functioned in the past, and does it function currently? Using key episodes in the development of democratic institutions, intellectual foundations of democracy, definitions of the term people, and the tension between state, federal mandates and individual liberty, this course drills down into the episodic conflicts that have shaped or misshapen, in some cases, the republic. The book Democracy, A Case Study sets down in remarkable detail David Moss's findings through 18-ish essays, each of which builds chronologically and rhetorically upon the former. With Tocqueville's scope and insight, David Moss offers a much-needed presentation of how democracy in America has always been grounded in conflict. In fact, this is sort of an aside, I am most struck by David's allusion early on in his book to the power of productive tension, which he argues is very present in the history of our democracies, or what political theorist Chantal Mouffe would call agonistics, or what Etienne Balibar refers to as equal liberty. For Moss, the critical question seems to be what makes conflict either constructive or destructive. I'll not embarrass David by listing here all of the high praise his book has already received. Instead, in standard democratic protocol, I'll yield the floor to Professor David Moss.
Great. So thanks for coming tonight. It's really an honor to be here and to get to talk about this book and also to talk about it in this bookstore. So I think the last time I was here was about 30 years ago. And it may have been across the street, I'm told. I can't remember. But anyway, I'm thrilled to be back here. So the book, as David told you, is really a history. But I know, despite that there's a lot of interest, or at least maybe a little bit of interest, in the state of our democracy right now. A few people have told me that. So in any event, I know I also have turned on the television from time to time, and I've noticed a few pundits who say that American democracy is in trouble, that it's in crisis. And so I thought I somehow will have to get to that. So by the end of the talk, I'll try to talk about that at least a little bit. But what I want to do is start with the history. And because it is at root a work of history, and I want to give you a sense of why I wrote the book and also what I was trying to do with it. So then, I guess after I get through that, then I might try to talk a little bit about what the history of American democracy tells us about the state of and the health of the democracy today. Okay, so that's the game plan. So we're going to start with some history, talk about the book a little bit, and then maybe get to the present, where maybe that's what people want to talk about in any case. We'll see. So starting with the history of American democracy, I thought, where do you begin? And I'm going to begin the same place that I began in the introduction to the book, on the right date, on July 4th, 1776. So that is a day that most people know. That's the day, of course, that the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty much the formal beginning of the country. Some people say it was 2 days before, but in that ballpark. What's much less well known about July 4th, 1776 is shortly after they approved the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress, the next thing they did is the Congress appointed a committee of three, a real heavyweight committee, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, to design a new seal for the United States. So if you want to think about it, they create a country, and the ink is still wet on this resolution, and they decide they need some marketing materials, which is literally what they wanted: an emblem. They wanted some kind of image, that, in fact, a double-sided image that would give a sense of what the country was and what the values were and what was the ambition. And so Adams and Jefferson and Franklin went to work. They spent 6 weeks, and they came up with a design, and Congress rejected it. So they didn't get their design. Congress picked a different design. But in the new design that was accepted, they took three Latin words from the original design, the one that Adams and Jefferson and Franklin came up with. So they got 3 words. And there are 3 words, you might know, the Latin words e pluribus unum. And so those 3 words moved from the original design, which was rejected, to the new design, which was accepted. And there's been some discussion over time of where those 3 words came from. So I just want to talk about that for a minute. So there's for a long time there was debate about it, and even for some time historians have known, I think, where it came from. But still, there's a lot of misnomers. And so I think I was actually taught in school that it was it was of Roman origin, which would make sense. It's Latin, and so that there was an idea that maybe it was Cicero or maybe it was Virgil or Horace. Turns out it wasn't any of those. So it was Benjamin Franklin plucked these words from the cover of a magazine that he liked, and it was a British magazine, and it was called Gentleman's Magazine. And it's not what you think. It was a literary magazine, and it was an unusual literary magazine because it included sort of excerpts, if you will, or pieces of many different literary works under one magazine. And this was distinctive. That wasn't very common. In fact, it was extremely uncommon at the time. And so, in fact, it was the first use of the word magazine for a publication. So that's the first time this word was ever used, and Gentleman's Magazine kind of came up with that. The definition, as you know, is repository or storehouse. That's what magazine means, and it was normally applied to kind of military affairs, to weapons or ammunition often. But Gentleman's Magazine wanted to apply it to the publication because their idea was that they were a storehouse. They were a repository of literary works. And Franklin liked that, and he also, actually, some of his work was published in Gentleman's Magazine. So he liked that. On the cover of the magazine was a sketch of an outstretched hand holding a bouquet of flowers. And right under it are the words e pluribus unum. And so the idea was that out of many flowers, one bouquet. Out of many literary works, one magazine. And so it was just one sort of jump for Franklin, who liked the idea that he was taking the new motto for the nation from essentially the equivalent of Reader's Digest, right? I mean, that's where it essentially came from. And so for him, it was out of many states and peoples, one nation. And so this was actually, I give this story because I think Franklin, one of the great minds, maybe one of the greatest minds the country's ever produced, he was really extraordinarily insightful. And so literally at the beginning, he saw that the unique promise of America lay in really harnessing difference and diversity. These are words that sometimes are used almost as cliches today, but he was really thinking, how do you harness difference and diversity toward common purpose through self-governance? And so it was really an extraordinary aspiration, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And the reason it was such an extraordinary aspiration is because people actually had very little in common. Right? So if you think about the different states, I mean, they didn't agree with each other on very many things if you look across the states. There were different religions, and he was well aware that you were starting to see the rise of different ethnicities. And so the thought was, what is holding this country together? And I think his basic idea was the process of self-governance itself. If we have that belief, if we have that common faith, that is out of it's not that we're getting rid of the many. It's out of many, one. And so that is e pluribus unum. I think it really was kind of a great insight from the beginning. And so I want to come back to that phrase a little later on. But I also wanted to tell you just talk a tiny bit more about Gentleman's Magazine, because like Gentleman's Magazine, the book, I guess, here's the book. The book brings together, is really a collection of seemingly disparate parts. So it's not typical in that each chapter follows immediately from the one before. It's made up really of 19 case studies, and they're episodes, as David said. They're kind of, I think, critical episodes in the history of American democracy. And each one, I think, they follow chronologically. But what you'll find is that each one gives sort of a lot of background. So they were meant to be read individually. So you can read each one, and you can read them separately. And so if you think about it, each case has a full history. And then each one ends at a decision point where there was some critical decision in American democracy. And those decision points move chronologically through the book. So that's how the thing is designed. And I thought that there was a bit of an analogy to Gentleman's Magazine. So this, as David said, this book grew out of a course that I created at Harvard. And I teach at the business school, but I created it mainly for undergraduates. And I had this idea to try to apply the case method to the history of American democracy. I don't think anyone had been stupid enough to try that before, but but I wrote, I spent a couple years writing with some wonderful co-authors these cases, and then the class moved forward on that basis. And so the undergraduates were a little surprised. So for example, 50% of the grade is based on class participation, so that was a little bit of a surprise. But the class is not a lecture at all. So I go in and I start asking them questions in sort of classic Harvard Business School fashion, except they're history questions. And so first we go through some of the background, and then eventually we come up to this decision point, which I'll give you a few examples of in a minute. And the students have to wrestle with that. And then at the end, I usually tell them what happened, but that's not really the sort of the culmination. The culmination is as the students are trying to figure this out themselves. And so it turned out to be an exciting class, at least for me. I hope for the students as well. And so I thought maybe I'd give you a little bit of a sense of what some of these episodes, I'll give you just a few examples, but there are 19 of them in the book. So the first one, chapter 1, it turns out is maybe one of the ones people seem to remember, maybe even most frequently, has to do with James Madison. So when James Madison was really probably the principal author of the Constitution. And so there's a set of he's back in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and what the case does is gives you the background leading up to that moment. So obviously there are a lot of authors of the Constitution, but as much as anyone, he wrote. He also wrote much of the Bill of Rights, which would come a little bit later. And what you see is that there had been what was called the critical period in the mid-1780s, a lot of problems in the country. There was Shays' Rebellion out in Massachusetts, if you remember that, some farmers rebelling, and there was Rhode Island was printing a lot of money, and they had a hyperinflation out in Rhode Island, and there was a general recession, and there were trade problems. States were putting tariffs on each other. I guess we wouldn't put tariffs very much anymore, but tariffs on each other, on the states. And in any event, the country was in big trouble. And so what did Madison do? He kind of retired to his home, which was a slave plantation, and he asked Jefferson, who had the best library of anyone in the country, could he have Jefferson's books on republics and confederacies, and so Jefferson started sending him trunks of books in all languages, and he was reading these books, and he was trying to think about what had gone wrong in their own republic, what had gone wrong in the American Confederacy. And so he came to some conclusions which are outlined in the case, and he started to think about how are we going to build something that works better, and what are the basic, what are the problems with a republic or democracy, and how can we fix them? So he ends up designing the basic structure of the Constitution. One thing that he proposes, which is not so well known, is he wanted a congressional veto over state laws. And that has since become known as, he called it a negative, and it's since become known as a federal negative. And so he actually said this was crucial to the survival of the republic. And his fear was that without it, he thought the states would become tyrannical, that the majorities would end up oppressing minorities. And he saw in his own home state of Virginia that the dominant religious group which was his actually, was oppressing minority religious groups, and they were using government power to do that. And so he was really worried about this. And so what he saw was the republic that he envisioned was not one of just majority rule, right? That's actually kind of easy. The hard thing about democracy as he saw it, and I think he certainly got this right. The hard thing is, how do you empower the majority and at the same time protect the minorities and the individuals? So how do you, what we would now call a liberal democracy, how do you do that? That's a real trick. And so if you think, that's what he was trying to figure out with the Constitution. Now, the group the most oppressed minority, black slaves, he didn't quite recognize, right, that problem. So he understood the concept, and the concept would again become deeply enmeshed with race as the country went forward. But interestingly, he was blind to this. So he wasn't actually incredibly fond of slavery, and he expected it would go away, but he didn't really see what he was writing about as fully applicable to that problem. Nevertheless, he was trying to figure it out, and what he thought was that small republics like the states would be more subject to tyranny, where majorities would form and they would oppress minorities. And so, for example, he thought Rhode Island, why did they have a hyperinflation? Because the debtors got together and they voted in laws that expropriated from the creditors. And inflation basically essentially gives money to those who borrow and takes money from those who lend. So he thought that that's what had been done there. And so he wanted all sorts of checks at the state level, but he hoped that there would be an ultimate check, that the federal government, the Congress, could veto a state law if they thought that it was dangerous. So anyway, the students are kind of surprised about this because it's not something that's taught very frequently in kind of high school or middle school. And so they start debating this, and Madison felt really, very strongly about it. And again, he said it was crucial. There are others who thought that this was going to lead to kind of enslavement of the states. So you see this battle, and then the students, the decision is going to be on June 8th in 1787, but it ends prematurely, right, in the case. And so the students are left to figure out, if they were delegates, how would they have voted. So we run the lead up. We try to analyze what was Madison's diagnosis, how did he understand the problem, and then we get to this decision. And that's all in the case. And the case also in the book ends prematurely. And I won't tell you what happened. There's an appendix if you want to cheat in the back. But that's how sort of all the cases are structured. Some of them are on very familiar topics, but maybe with a little bit of a twist. So, for example, there's a standard question of should Lincoln have resupplied Fort Sumter. So this is the question when South Carolina secedes and the new president comes in, and he has to deal with this secession. And the immediate question is, there's a federal fort in South Carolina, which the South Carolinians aren't too excited about allowing that to continue. So if he's going to resupply it, there might be some shooting, and so he knows that. And so the deeper question is, and it actually is a big question: should he let the South go? Should he just let them secede, or should he force them to stay in? And now it's sort of a question people take for granted, but if you think about it, it's an awfully hard question. If the southern states wanted to leave, the North, by the way, was industrializing just fine without them. And it was clear there was going to be violence. He had no idea the degree of violence. When he first instated a draft, it was for 90 days. He had no idea how long this was going to go and how catastrophic it was going to be for the country. But nevertheless, there was a question. And so the students debate that. And at first, it seems like there's only one possible answer, of course. But after a while, it becomes quite a discussion. And I hope, if you were to engage with that case, you might think about it's a hard when you think about how many lives were ultimately lost. And you think about both the upside and the downside. Interestingly, when he first was taking on this decision, there was really no assumption that he was going to eliminate slavery. He didn't want slavery to expand beyond the southern states, but he actually wasn't talking about eliminating slavery at that point. So that was an issue to come. So that's sort of a common episode. Many people know it, but they maybe don't think about it quite in that way. There are also some episodes that you've probably never heard of, like a murder trial in late 1870s Virginia, where two young black men are accused of murder, and they face an all-white grand jury and an all-white trial jury. And their lawyers, who turned out to be pretty good lawyers, appeal to a federal judge, and a federal judge, so it's pretty unusual, a federal judge, Judge Alexander Rives, decides to seize them from state custody and try them in federal court before a mixed-race jury. That's number one. And Judge Rives decides that he's a Southerner, he's going to go indict all of the county judges who've been calling all-white juries. So he calls a grand jury and he indicts all these judges all over the state. That causes quite a ruckus. It's in the national news. And then both of those cases end up going to the Supreme Court. And so again, the basic idea is, what would you do if you were the court? How would you side? Is he right? Is it appropriate? Is it legal? So these are the kinds of decisions, and they run up to the 21st century. And so the course ended up working, surprisingly well at Harvard, and then it started spreading to high schools. And so that was a surprise and kind of exciting. And so a number of teachers whose students had gone to Harvard, they heard about it and they wanted to do a few cases. So we tried that, and then it started to expand. So now we have a pilot running. A very generous donor has funded it. We've got 40 schools in 11 states involved, and we're going to probably double that over the next year. And we're just testing out, does case method history work? It works at the college level. Does it work at the high school level? And so far, the early signs are incredibly positive. So I'm excited about that. It's kind of a new way of teaching history and civics. But we'll see. We'll see. The jury's still out. So as you look across, I'll probably wrap up in just a couple minutes. As David hinted at, as you look across these cases, so I think each case I find pretty interesting. Hopefully you might find a few of them interesting as well. But as you look across the case, there are some themes that emerge as well. And one of the most striking ones, at least to me, is this idea of conflict. And so, sometimes people like to think, and I hear this said actually of our democracy now, that we need to kind of cool down a little bit. We need to meet in the middle. We need more compromise. We need more moderation. We need to find common ground. I'll say that, that's all wonderful, but I'm not sure that that's actually so consistent necessarily with what has been kind of the most productive or healthiest elements in the past in democratic decision making. So, if you look back and you find some moments where you think some pretty good things happened, and we could talk about what those might be, and you look at it, you see actually there was a lot of conflict. There was bitter fighting among, sometimes across parties, even within parties, ideological divisions, partisan divisions, parochial divisions. And so the question that I kept coming to is, why was it that in some cases that conflict, that tension ended up being, in retrospect, highly productive? And in other contexts, and one in particular, the lead up to the Civil War, but others as well, it could be so destructive. And so, some of these cases you look at and you see conflict looks very similar in, for example, antebellum New York as they were debating public education. So they were trying to figure out, should we have public education? That was a big, I would call that a huge innovation. And it actually helped New York move forward. They were following Massachusetts. But it was really intensely debated. In fact, it was every bit as divisive as healthcare is today. In fact, maybe even more divisive, because they passed it and repealed it, so I'm not predicting anything, but passed it and repealed it. And people were saying, why should I pay for the education of family next door? They should pay for their own kids' education. Why should I pay for that? But over time, you see the logic of this thing. You see what the fight's about, and you see why they enact it. The fighting that went into that was intense. And I could give you many other examples. That ends up with a pretty, at least in my view, productive outcome. When you look at the lead up to the Civil War, you see very similar types of political debates, political arguments between the South and the North, except it ends up, obviously, the most destructive possible outcome that you could have. It degenerates into violence. So one of the big questions that I think about is what differentiates productive from destructive conflict. And to me, I would say, I would come to this sort of loose phrase, but I'll try to give it a little definition, which is, it comes down to, I think, the strength of our culture of democracy. So that is, how committed are we to the democracy itself? How much faith do we have in this shared project? How much are we willing to put the health of the democracy before our individual interests, before the policies that we want, the political leaders that we want, the party that we want? And if you look at the debate in New York for public education, or many, many other debates, what you'll see is that, interestingly, democracy often was front and center in that debate. For example, in the education debate in particular, democracy was the principal argument. Why do we need public education? Because the democracy can't be sustained without it. People need to be able to read. That is both people who are already in the country, you saw the franchise was growing at that time beyond property holders, but also lots of people are coming in as immigrants who don't know how to read English. We need to change that if they're going to be productive citizens. So there was this argument about democracy being made, and somehow this democracy argument ends up being kind of the glue that holds people together. And so if you think about a country that has no ethnic solidarity, it has no religious solidarity. In fact, it doesn't have ideological solidarity. I mean, there are really very significant differences across different states, across different sections. And yet, what was the logic? What holds it together? It is, as I think Franklin saw right at the beginning, it was in fact the faith in self-governance. And when that faith broke down, for example, in the late 1850s, when Southerners decided that their identity was more important than national identity, and that it didn't really matter that Lincoln won the election. It wasn't really contested. Did he get the plurality of votes? Did he get a majority in the Electoral College? He wasn't legitimate because he opposed the expansion of slavery in the eyes of many Southerners. And so once that faith in the democracy breaks down, well, then the conflict becomes awfully destructive. And so I think, to now kind of come up to the present, at least in my mind, I think that's the question we should be asking ourselves. I don't think we should just be looking at individual policies, however good or bad you think they might be. So obviously you need to fight about individual policies. If you support them, if you oppose them, that's all of our jobs as citizens. But I think if you want to ask yourself the health of the democracy, it's a bit of a different question. What I've seen over time is almost every generation, as early as 1800, you can see this, very credible people have said American democracy is in trouble. It's about to collapse. And often it was because their side was losing. And often when there's a policy you don't like, it's easy to say, well, something's wrong with the democracy, because obviously rational people could never produce this outcome that I don't like, right? But you know, history has a way of moving around, and you know, you win, you lose. So that's not maybe the best predictor. But when that glue begins to weaken, when the culture of democracy begins to weaken, then I think there's something different at play. And I will say that, you know, there are some reasons to be concerned, not just over the last months or years, but over the last several decades. There are a number of indicators to suggest that commitment to the democracy, faith in democracy, faith in each other, has declined. So I think there has been some atrophy with respect to the culture of democracy. So in my view, that's a significant challenge. And so when I think about the course and when I think about this book, one goal is to try to send the message that culture of democracy matters. But another is the course, and I hope the book is a vehicle for strengthening that. So in the course, one of the things I saw is people got a lot more excited about the democracy, about what it means to have self-government and what our roles are as we started debating these cases. And so I'm hoping as people read the book, they'll not only read it, I hope they'll talk with other people about it. There's a lot less of that in this country than, as you know, my colleague Bob Putnam has talked about. There's a lot less of that than there should be, but there are book groups, and that's one of the nice ways in which people interact. And so I'm hoping that people might actually not just read, but take up these questions and try to debate them and not immediately turn to the appendix to see what happened. And so anyway, that's my quick take. I hope I didn't go too long, but if there are any questions or thoughts, I'm happy to take them.
First of all, thank you. Just to reiterate that if you do have a question, and I do hope it's a question, one of the mics would be great, and speak into it so we can record you. Thank you.
Well, actually, I have two questions, but I really request really that you choose only one of them in deference to the number of other people that have questions here. So the first one's kind of simple. It's in your in the idea of the case study approach to history teaching in high school. Does you imagine it replacing other history courses? Is it an alternative, or is it sort of an add-on? So that's the first question. The second question is more to the point of the book. And I wanted to dig in a little bit on this idea of conflict can be constructive versus conflict can be so extreme that it's destructive. And you gave some guideline on when it's gone too far, and that's sort of violence, when it ends in violence and death. But I wanted to ask, how do you decide, or at what point does it get to that line and start to cross it? At what point can you assume that democracy and that argument, strife, will not end up ultimately self-correcting and being constructive? How do you know when you said when the glue starts to come apart, and so that's sort of sounds like it's the point at which you sense that things are going to run downhill and that eventually the nation will collapse or go into another civil war. That's really bad things. But anyway, that's kind of the nature of the second question. What are the beyond just this vague idea of the glue? What are the real markers of going too far?
Yeah. So this question of how do you know when? Let me come back to that one. Let me first take up your first one. And you said only one question, but I think I'm going to try to do both. So the cases, you said sort of, is it a sort of a supplement or a complement? Is it an alternative or not? We don't know yet. I'm guessing that it's going to be a complement in different ways. So right now, some of the teachers who are doing this are using a few cases mixed in with their standard curriculum. And the students particularly like those cases, but we don't know if they did many more of them, would they still like it quite as much. So they seem to like the cases more than their textbook, but But if you remove the textbook, that might be a different issue. So I don't know. There are a few teachers who are experimenting with doing it kind of complete. So full courses, basically taking that whole course. And those also seem to be working. My own view is I don't think that's really a full replacement for a survey course. So I don't quite see it that way. I think you could conceivably get there, but that wouldn't probably be kind of my preference if I were trying to, teachers are going to do it the way they want to. My guess is ultimately we probably need something in the way of survey courses, and I think it'd be great if we could go a little deeper with the cases, either as elective courses or as sort of part of the general survey courses. So I don't know if that gives you a sense of it. On how do you know when? So that's a great question. So that's why I want to take both of them. So as I said, really in every generation, and even more frequently than that, Americans have basically said their democracy was in crisis. And so you can find over and over and over and over again. And for a while, I sort of found that almost a little funny. I think in the book I might have used the metaphor. It's like, the burning bush or something, right? It's always burning. It's never consumed. But then it struck me that actually there's something very healthy about that, which is, there is a bit of hypochondria, but it's maybe good hypochondria, because when people worry, they kind of put in place reforms. And the reforms may be helpful, they may not be helpful, but the process of trying to reform the democracy, which is a regular, periodic thing, that turns out, I think, to be enormously healthy. So it reminds us what our principles are. You see engagement go up. You see people get more involved. So I think that, in a sense, we're constantly running into the culture of democracy weakens. In fact, I brought up public education before. One of the reasons Horace Mann in Massachusetts was pushing that so far, he was worried about the culture of democracy. And that was a way of re-energizing as well. So, there are one problem, maybe an odd problem, that I point out in the conclusion to the book, is that one of the things that I think was one of the reform movements that was most dynamic and most constructive in sort of rebuilding this culture over and over were suffrage movements. So you see first, the movement away from property-based suffrage, and then you see the movement away from race-based suffrage, and then you see deterioration in that progress. Meanwhile, you see movement away from male-based suffrage, and then come back around again and work on race and try to, and through the Voting Rights Act eventually. But each of those movements was enormously dynamic, and it was like a wonderful civics class for the nation. And there is an irony that we achieved something very close to full suffrage. But what that means is there are no mass suffrage movements anymore. And if you look, it's roughly from the time of the last major suffrage movement, which would have been in the mid-1960s, that you start to see the changes that we've seen in deterioration in confidence in democracy and personal engagement and so on. And one of the reasons may be that, in a sense, we reached that plateau, right? We reached something which was very healthy, which was near, not quite, but almost universal suffrage. And yet there was something healthy about the movements as well. And so how do we replace that? And so my guess is we need to start to think about how do we energize again to try to defend the democracy against some kinds of decay. My guess is that's a pretty healthy process. So I don't think it's in trouble or it's not. I think it's always in some trouble. And our job is, to keep trying to rectify. And in the process of doing that, we re-engage. I hope very much that we see a little more of that in the months and years ahead.
To continue the conflict theme, what were the cases that you had between conflicts between different branches of the federal government, specifically, and today's events come to mind, between the executive branch and the judicial branch? Yeah. What were the cases, and if you could cheat and tell us how were they resolved? I know it's in the appendix, but...
Yeah, so, let me just focus on one because it's the most striking. And so it's fairly well known, but sometimes we forget how significant it was. So, the Native Americans, the Cherokee nation, they pursued a rather remarkable strategy as particularly in a number of states, as sort of settlers were moving into their land. They had sort of marked off certain amounts of land by treaty, and those treaties were being invaded. And so there was a question of, do you fight? How do you defend it? And the Cherokee went to court. And so they hired some pretty good lawyers, and they went to the Supreme Court. They lost their first case, but they won the second case before the Supreme Court, and they won in a pretty overwhelming way. And they were thrilled because the idea that they could win, right? So they thought, would the court really respect? They had good arguments, but would they be respected given that they were Cherokee, right? They were Native Americans, right? And they were, right? So the court respected the argument. The court made the decision, and Jackson didn't actually say what I'm about to say, but he's widely quoted as this. It turns out it was some other kind of publicist who said this, but he said something to the effect of, the court can say what they want, now let them enforce it, right? And so he did not enforce that decision, and it was a dead letter. And it was one of the most dramatic episodes. But what people sometimes forget is the connection. So what happens then is there's this mass forced migration, and you get 4,000 deaths that are, I think, a direct consequence of the violation of the rule of law. So had the court actually been upheld or enforced, had the decision been enforced, those deaths would not, I think it's hard to believe those deaths would have occurred. So you see the remarkable power of the court to sort of, even a court that was, deeply racist at the time, there's no way around that, but a court that would have made a huge difference. And then you see when a branch decides not to follow, and Jackson was able to do that. So there's certainly some many good things that Jackson did. That was certainly his worst moment, and as a country we paid for it dearly. So it's sometimes maybe at the moment people can get riled up on one side or the other, but we can lose track of really how important the rule of law is. It is precisely the defense of minorities, right? That the courts, the courts are not a majority institution for the most part, right? That was the vision. That's why they're there. And so if we don't respect them, there can be some. You can see that's a pretty awful outcome from even just one decision being overlooked.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a question, and maybe it's already in your conclusion. I just haven't gotten there yet. So you talk about the culture of democracy and our faith in democracy. I think that it sort of begs this question of what leads people to lose faith in their democracy. And to me, the logical answer is if the democracy isn't representing or protecting my interests as an individual. And so if the democracy isn't benefiting them, and I'd even take that further and sort of say in the current context, or people have the perception that the democracy isn't benefiting them. So is that something that you address in the conclusion about, what leads people to lose faith in their democracy and sort of put the pressure on the culture of democracy?
So there's a risk that what I'm about to say is circular. So if it is, forgive me, right? So I don't actually think I agree with your assessment, though, right? So if you think about one of the most dramatic kind of exercises in democracy was the civil rights movement. There was a group that the democracy was not serving. So the country was not protecting, was not serving. I think it would be very hard to say that those who were most actively engaged in the civil rights movement saw they were engaged and enthusiastic about the democracy because it was defending them. In fact, almost just the opposite. And so somehow they had some deeper faith in the principles that those principles could be meaningful, right? That it could defend them, and that their action would make a difference. And so I'm not. So I guess I have maybe a slightly different view. So as a result, I think it's hard to know exactly why. And to me, this comes back to why civics, not just mechanical civics, not just there are three branches of government and their checks and balances, that doesn't seem to get people very excited, and understandably so, right? But civics in the sense of what an extraordinary thing we're trying to do, Like, it's hard for kids in a classroom, it's hard for us in this room to govern ourselves. I mean, if we had to make any difficult decisions, boy, it's a hard thing to do. The idea that the country is doing this on an ongoing basis and making decisions, obviously it makes some very bad decisions, but the amazing thing is it makes any good decisions at all. It makes enough that the country GDP seems to grow, and there's at least some progress on rights over time. So somehow the magic of the whole thing seems like we have to instill that in each other and engage with it. And so I think the educational system is very important. I think things like juries are very important. And I guess when I look, I think that there are fewer opportunities for civic engagement now than maybe there have been in the past. And that we could talk about that. I'm happy to sort of give, but I think the act of being, this is what I was saying, it could be a little circular. The act of being involved and kind of feeling it and seeing it is actually quite powerful. And so, so the honest answer, I'm not sure I know why, but that's sort of what I'm betting on. And my sense is it's better if we have more of a national discussion than less. If democracy looms larger in our discussions than smaller, and that it plays a larger role in what we teach in schools and not a smaller role. So, but I think it's a hard question.
There's a really dark underside to our culture, and it even becomes questionable as to really how much of a real democracy we have, or is it more illusion than a true democracy? Okay. Now, it doesn't seem that we yet have even broached a dialogue to start to analyze structurally the form in which we want to be governed. Now, it started out that way because we were a tabula rasa. We had no government. But now we have government, we have institutions, and a lot of vested interests. And it's very difficult to start to pick into that and get to the root of the problems because, for example, the Congress and the President and the three branches, I'll use a crude word, but to some extent are so corrupted that they can't implement or even start to implement the necessary changes in form and get more checks and balances. Just one example quickly. James, I believe his name was Morris from Pennsylvania or whatever, he did a lot of the writing behind the scenes stuff. He was interested in commercial interests. He had a lot of interests himself. And I believe because of that, we got no checks and balances on special interests of any type. And I'm not saying left or right or whatever, but our Constitution is really missing a check and a balance on special interests. And that's a broad category. So I'm not trying to play politics with it. I'm just saying it's an overlooked aspect that we're kind of suffering from now. That's it.
Okay, so I'm going to infer a whole bunch of questions from that. Let me try to answer them. So first, and I'm actually going to tie it back. I don't know your name, but I'm going to try it also. I'm going to keep coming back and trying to answer Elizabeth's question as I go. So first, you said there's no check on special interests. So look, Madison said that there are two core problems of democracy. Okay, one, which is the one I already talked about, which is that the majority can oppress a minority. But the other is that a minority, in this case he was thinking of an elite, can grab hold of the political process and use it to their advantage, right? So that's the part you're talking about. He thought the tyranny of the majority was a worse problem because if you're the victim of that, it's even worse than the others. But he recognized both, and they did try to set up some checks. I would say, in my mind, probably the I don't want to say it's perfect. It's for sure not. But the press represents. In fact, there's a lot of attacking of the press, but the press represents maybe the most powerful check on special interests that exists. And if you look at moments when special interests lose, when it's because the press is enormously involved. So I'll give you one example that's not in the book, but I've written about it elsewhere. If you look at sort of the regulation of toxic chemicals. The chemical industry, not surprisingly, was staunchly against that, and was able to keep that legislation from being passed until Love Canal, and a newspaper in Niagara Falls and the New York Times started writing about Love Canal, and that really changed public perception when people started to understand what was going on, and suddenly you start seeing some legislation, pretty dramatic, Superfund passed. And the special interests lost at that point. So the press can play, a powerful role. So I don't want to suggest that it's a perfect solution, but it's at least an imperfect solution. And so
particularly if they become a special interest of their own,
right,
or are
right.
taken over.
And so it's extremely important that the press remains independent, and it's also important that the press is itself not captured, right, by special interests. So that's a challenge. Let me just come back to one thing you were saying, which I think maybe I'm going to wrap around a little bit to Elizabeth's question again. So you were saying that the structures weren't really designed, or sort of don't quite work in the modern day, and there aren't. So one thing that I do take up in the book in that respect is, if you look at the federal government was not designed to be very large. It was designed to be small. And it's the government by far with the least popular input. So you get to elect the president, although it's through an electoral college, but more or less. You get to elect somebody from your congressional district. And you get to elect 2 senators, although that was not originally the game. Originally they were appointed and then they were elected. But there's no referendum, there's no direct democracy, there's no initiatives, there's no ballot initiatives, there's no election of, so in the states, most states, you elect attorney generals, you elect treasurers, you elect a whole bunch of officers. And what you see is the states used to look like the federal government, but they had, through constitutional amendment, they all evolved to actually have dramatically more input. And also cities as well. Cities have a lot more popular input. And if you look at people's faith in government, these faith in government numbers, which have fallen so dramatically, what's often forgotten is that's federal, faith in the federal government. If you look at faith in state and local, they're actually pretty good. And I think that there was, in a sense, an error in the 1930s, that as the federal government began to expand, and I think it probably had to expand to deal with an increasingly national economy, the democracy was not expanded, right? So you did not allow more popular input into the federal government, even as you dramatically increased the power of the federal government. And so my guess is this question of engagement, and I think if you ask a lot of people who are disengaged, a lot of them are upset at the federal government. And one answer is to make the federal government smaller. That's one answer. Another answer, or maybe you could do both, but another answer is to try to make the federal government more responsive to popular concerns. And so I think that is a structural problem. And I think that it was, in fact, by design. But it was not with the understanding that the federal government would be ever as large as it is now. And so that structure, maybe we have to think about how that changes. It's a hard thing to do.
Yes. Well, actually, on that last point, I can't help but think of civil rights and how if there were no federal government, there would still be a great disparity, even greater. What I'd like to say is that first, I think your book sounds fascinating. It's a great idea, and particularly using it in high school, I think would be terrific. I've heard that there's not much teaching of civics anymore, and I do recall it as being extremely dull, but this would be a wonderful way to make all the points in a much more interesting context, maybe pulling out 2 or 3 case studies that are more relevant to the student body you have. So anyway, I'm glad you're pushing that. My question is rather simple. I just wonder, and I don't know how many, maybe you've only taught the course once, but do you use original materials in conjunction with the cases?
Yeah. So some of the cases include some primary documents, and there's certainly lots of passages from primary documents. My sort of view is that sometimes, that can be a little overblown in courses. That the job of the historian is to delve into the primary documents. But for the most part, we're not training people to be professional historians, right? We're trying, and so sometimes documents can be enormously valuable, but as I've sort of looked at some of the history curricula, sometimes it makes me nervous that the documents are kind of so cut up and sanitized, and you get these little snippets as if you're reading a primary document, and so I'm not quite as much of a fan sometimes of that approach, but there are a number of primary documents, usually in fairly long, like several pages, not small snippets, as appendices to various cases, and so those can be helpful. But it's a little bit more synthetic, which is that there's the case is trying to provide sort of factually the material, and then the students decide when you see what you'll see. I hope you'll see from the cases that there's not an attempt to really twist an interpretation. So people who write these cases say the ideal case is analysis free. Well, no case can be analysis free, but there's an attempt. There's an attempt to try to put the analysis in the words of the people who were there at the time and so on, and to keep a little bit of distance. So in a way, there's a strong primary element running through the cases, but for the most part, not primary documents. Many high school teachers, though, by the way, are supplementing the cases with, if they don't think the appendices go far enough, they'll bring in some primary documents themselves. And let me just say, if you know of a high school that where you were recruiting high schools to do this pilot, and eventually we're going to try to, if it works, expand it much more. But if you have a high school that might want to try it out, we're excited to get them involved.
Brunswick High School, Brunswick, Maine.
Yeah, in Maine.
The questions have been stellar, so I'm charging you with the last and most stellar of the questions, if you will.
I'll try. A lot of pressure here. Thank you for a fascinating.
You're not on the hook, she is. So.
Okay. Fascinating discussion, and I like your focus on civics. I think we do a much better job of teaching consumerism versus civics and citizenship, and that's a huge problem. Getting back to your concept of glue, how much does quality, trusted leadership have to do with quality democracy? And what scares me the most right now, and you brought it up yourself, is the press and what our current government is doing to delegitimize the press. If that turns out to be successful for the administration, and people believe that we don't have an honest press, where do we go for our information?
So, right. So look. So that would be a devastating outcome.
Absolutely.
And there's there's some indications that significant number of people in the country don't believe the press, or at least don't believe some parts of the press. I guess my read is that there's still significant interest in the press, even as people bash it, and that there's a pretty good amount of attention paid to it, and it does seem to move. If you kind of look at when the press gets involved in a particular issue, often it's because there's some sort of scandal or something titillating around some issue, and then the press gets in. When they do, I think it continues to move public opinion quite dramatically. So I guess I'm not quite convinced of the very pessimistic view that it's already kind of over or something. But I think that we're gonna find out if over the next few years about that. And I think it's common to attack the press. That's been true throughout the country's history. But it's hard for me to think of a more important, if you will, informal institution. So it's not the structure of it's not defined in the Constitution. It's mentioned once in the Constitution, the First Amendment. But apart from that, it's not structured. It's not an institution of government. Apart from the formal structures, I can't imagine a more important piece. So we have to defend our press.
Yeah. Bottom line is, I think our democracy is going to be severely tested, and it's going to be our citizenship that's going to decide where we're going from here. Thanks.
Yeah. You know what? That though often that's frequently true. Even when there are good leaders in place, when there are bad leaders in place, it happens at the state level, federal. Often it comes back to the public, and when the public sort of loses its attention, you get not very good outcomes. And so hopefully the public will be engaged. Yeah.
Final question.
I'm not sure this is really a stellar question, but I was wondering what you thought about the Electoral College. You mentioned something about it, and I thought, well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I wrote a paper when I was a junior in high school saying that, saying that they should get rid of the Electoral College. And look, it was part of the original bargain. I mean, it was a lot of people have talked about how it was sort of this independent source of judgment, right? That if the people kind of got carried away and elected someone who shouldn't be president, that the Electoral College could correct that. I think even even more, there was a sense that that there was sort of a bargain between the states, and the Electoral College gave a little bit more weight to smaller states and so on. So I think I don't. My guess is it's not an institution we're going to be able to eliminate, and that if I had to set as a priority, it wouldn't be my highest priority of a constitutional amendment. But probably it's not clear exactly to me what purpose it serves at this point. So, if I had, if there was a choice, I guess if I had a vote on that particular issue, I probably would go with my paper in high school from junior year. But I think it's a close call, and again, I think there are some other things that are even more important. Like, for example, there's not a constitutional amendment that gives a right to vote. I think that would probably be a good idea. So I mean, I could think about some constitutional amendments that might, if you could actually get to that place. Maybe just on that note, can I have one more minute? So one case that the students find, I think particularly dramatic and which is not well known is something called Doar's Rebellion, and you'll see why I'm bringing it up in this context. So in Rhode Island, Rhode Island had started as a colony which was by far the most democratic. It had virtually everybody, at least men, I should say, could vote, and it was very widespread. And as time went by, it ended up being property holders and a smaller and smaller group of property holders. And by the 1830s, they were the least democratic state in the country. Anyway, there's this guy named Thomas Dorr who was a Harvard graduate. He was not well liked by his fellow students. When they drank too much at finals time, he reported them to the administration, and he was just not well liked. But he really got a bee in his bonnet about. He was an elite. He went to Harvard, and he had the right to vote in Rhode Island, and he was from a wealthy family. But he was looking at what was going on in other states, and he just thought it was wrong that there wasn't a universal right to vote. He didn't think about extending to women, but he did think that both blacks and whites should vote. So he was quite advanced for his time. And in any event, so he was trying to figure out what to do, and he and this broader suffrage movement in Rhode Island came up with an extraordinary idea that he helped to fund. And so what they did was they ran they drafted a new constitution, extra legally. Okay, so they ran an election for delegates to a constitutional convention that had no legal basis. So they just did it like as if we held a vote. We could, on the internet, hold a vote for delegates, and it wouldn't have any legal grounding, but we could have a group come together and draft a new constitution. It wouldn't have any legal basis. That's what they did. And they wrote this constitution that had a much broader right to vote. And then they actually decided to have a ratification process. So they had voting all over the state, and they got a huge vote, much bigger than the vote for the regular government, and it passed, and it passed quite overwhelmingly, and it had no legal force, none, but it had huge moral force, and so the government was starting to get the legitimate government. I don't think they were so legitimate, but the so-called charter government of Rhode Island started to get pretty nervous. Now, Thomas Dorr got a little bit carried away, and he decided to not stop there. He then decided to hold elections. And there were elections, and he was elected governor. And then he claimed he was governor. In fact, if you look at the Rhode Island website, they list him as governor with a little asterisk. Anyway, so the charter government said it was treason, and they ended up eventually arresting him. He tried to take one of the armories and but anyway, he didn't do very well. And he was arrested and put in prison, and he got very sick in prison. Didn't go well for him. But what was interesting is even though he lost that battle, he won the war, because the charter government very soon after started to introduce amendments to dramatically expand suffrage. It was clear what the public wanted. And so it has struck me. Right now, since 1992 is the last time I think we had a constitutional amendment pass, and it's one of the longest periods. I think it's the third longest period we've ever gone without a constitutional amendment. I think Congress would be in no mood to pass basically anything onto the states. But it has struck me whether an extra legal process could be an interesting one, where the public begins to pass an amendment that has no legal force but might have a great deal of moral force. And so anyway, it struck me that kind of their exercise that they did back in the early 1840s might have some bearing for us now.